It was a time when the world seemed to breathe for the first time in decades. After years of endless conflicts that had left scars on cities, families, and hearts, people finally began to feel the fragile touch of peace. Streets that had once been filled with the sounds of gunfire and shouting were now quiet. Markets were open, and children ran freely through parks that were being rebuilt after years of neglect. Families gathered without fear, sharing meals and laughter that had long been silenced by war. This peace was not perfect, and no one pretended it was. But for many it was enough to hope again, to dream again, to believe that the horrors of the past might finally be left behind. The peace that had been achieved was not easy. It had taken years of talks, meetings, and tireless negotiations. Leaders from different nations, often enemies, had sat at long tables, their faces tired but determined. They argued, shouted, and sometimes walked away, but they always returned. Behind closed doors, agreements were drafted that would prevent further conflicts, that would create boundaries, trade agreements, and shared responsibilities. Every signature on the Pact carried the weight of millions of lives and the hope of future generations. For ordinary people, this peace was more than just words on paper. It was the promise that their children could grow up without the constant fear of bombs and bullets. It meant that mothers no longer had to worry about sending their sons into battle, that fathers could rebuild their homes without fearing that tomorrow would bring them back to a battlefield. Shops began to reopen, schools welcomed students again, and hospitals could finally focus on healing rather than emergency triage. Small communities celebrated, lighting fires in the evenings and sharing stories of survival and courage. Each of these moments, simple as they were, carried the weight of history, a quiet acknowledgement of the suffering that had come before. Among these communities were people whose lives had been defined by the conflict. There was a teacher who had continued to educate children even when the classroom was nothing more than a ruined building. She now walked through repaired streets, smiling as her students ran to her with books in hand. There was a young man who had been a soldier since he was barely old enough to understand the meaning of war. He now walked among crowds, his uniform replaced with ordinary clothes, feeling for the first time in years the strange lightness of freedom. There was a mother who had lost everything, yet still found the courage to open a small shop, selling bread and simple goods to neighbors. Her smile, warm and cautious, was a small rebellion against the memory of loss. Despite all the hope, the world was still fragile. The peace was like a delicate glass, beautiful and shimmering, but with the faintest touch it could shatter. Many people were aware of this. They whispered in cafes and marketplaces about old grudges that had never truly faded, about political leaders whose promises seemed sincere, but whose actions could be unpredictable. Yet most chose to cling to hope. They told themselves that even if the peace was fragile, it was still better than the certainty of war. This hope became a shield, protecting hearts and minds from fear, allowing life to flourish in ways that had been impossible for decades. In the cities, life slowly returned to a rhythm that had been lost. Streets buzzed with energy once more. Bicycles and scooters replaced the constant roar of military vehicles. Children played football in squares that had once been battlefields. Families picnicked along riversides, and street performers entertained crowds with music and laughter. Shops sold fresh bread, colorful fabrics, and flowers, small reminders that beauty could still exist after destruction. Cafes became gathering places for conversations about everything except war. People spoke about books, movies, local politics, and dreams for the future. It was as if the world was learning to breathe again after a long, suffocating struggle. However, not all wounds were visible. Many carried the invisible scars of loss and fear. Soldiers haunted by memories of violence found it hard to trust the calm. Children who had seen parents taken or homes destroyed struggled to believe that the peace would last. Some families, still mourning those they had lost, could not find joy in the small celebrations. Yet even among the grief, there was a stubborn spark of resilience. Communities came together to support one another. Neighbors helped rebuild homes, shared food, and comforted those who cried at night. This human connection became a foundation for the fragile peace, proving that no treaty could succeed without the hearts of the people embracing it. Leaders, too, understood that peace required constant effort. They traveled across nations, speaking to citizens, visiting schools, hospitals, and markets. Their speeches were filled with promises of unity and progress. While some doubted their sincerity, many listened and felt a cautious optimism. Decisions were made to invest in infrastructure, education, and healthcare. Aid was sent to areas most affected by the conflict. Borders were patrolled not by soldiers ready to fight, but by teams ensuring safe passage and trade. It was an unprecedented effort to make peace tangible, not just a series of words in a document. Yet for all the rebuilding and reconciliation, there were subtle signs that the peace could be threatened. Minor disputes arose over resources, borders, and agreements. Old rivalries buried under years of suffering began to surface. Some politicians and influential figures quietly sought personal advantage, whispering of mistrust, questioning the intentions of others. Ordinary citizens busy rebuilding their lives often missed these signs, focusing instead on survival and hope. But for those paying attention, it was clear that this peace, though celebrated, was delicate and dependent on the vigilance of every individual. In this environment, ordinary acts became acts of courage. A man helping his neighbor repair a roof was not just fixing a house. He was repairing the fabric of society. A young girl planting a garden in a bombed-out lot was not just growing flowers. She was nurturing hope. Communities that had once been divided by ideology or fear now found strength in cooperation. Festivals and cultural events, once impossible, returned with a renewed significance. They reminded people that life in its simplest forms could thrive even after the darkest times. The galaxy, or rather, the wider world watching humanity, was intrigued by these efforts. Observers, historians, and international communities noted how a species that had been at the brink of self-destruction was now attempting something extraordinary, rebuilding not just buildings and borders, but trust and empathy. For humanity, this was more than political or social progress. It was a chance to prove that peace was not only achievable but sustainable if nurtured carefully. In households across the world, ordinary conversations reflected this hope. Families discussed dreams, students spoke of aspirations they had never dared to consider, and neighbors exchanged stories of past struggles with laughter and tears. Life, in its most human sense, began to flourish. People walked with lighter steps, laughed more freely, and looked to the future with cautious optimism. The lessons of the past were remembered, but they no longer dictated every action. People understood that peace was not merely the absence of war. It was a choice made every day, through acts of kindness, understanding, and courage. And so, as the sun rose over cities and villages alike, it illuminated a world that was healing. Broken buildings were being repaired. Scarred landscapes were slowly becoming green, and hearts that had been hardened by grief began to soften once more. Humanity had survived its darkest hours, and for a brief moment, it seemed that the future could belong to everyone. Yet beneath the surface of this fragile calm, there were whispers of tension, subtle enough to go unnoticed but powerful enough to remind all that peace was never guaranteed. In this first chapter of renewal, people learned a vital lesson, that even after devastation, hope could bloom, and the simplest acts of human courage and compassion could shape the course of history. The world watched, and humanity, for the first time in decades, dared to believe that it could keep its promise to itself, a promise of peace, of life, and of the future. Even as people celebrated the fragile peace, there were quiet cracks forming beneath the surface. The world seemed calm, but in truth, tensions were simmering in places few noticed. Small disagreements over borders, trade, and resources began to appear. These conflicts were minor at first, arguments between local communities, disputes over water and farmland, but they carried echoes of older, deeper grudges. The wounds of past wars were never fully healed, and for some, bitterness lingered like a shadow, waiting for the right moment to rise again. Leaders tried to maintain order, but the task was not simple. They were faced with growing demands from citizens who wanted justice, progress, and security. At the same time, behind closed doors, some powerful individuals sought personal advantage, questioning alliances and exploring ways to gain power even at the cost of stability. Diplomats worked tirelessly to keep communication open, attending meetings that often lasted for days, negotiating and renegotiating terms. While the world publicly celebrated unity, the reality was far more fragile, and every decision carried enormous weight. Ordinary people, however, remained largely unaware of the hidden tensions. Most were focused on rebuilding their lives. Farmers returned to their fields, shopkeepers reopened businesses, and children played without fear. The daily rhythm of life, cooking, cleaning, learning, and laughing, continued. Streets were filled with voices, the sound of music, and the clatter of markets. Yet behind this bustling energy, there were subtle signs that peace was not entirely secure. Minor conflicts began to flare, unresolved issues from the past refused to fade, and whispers of mistrust grew in the background. A small village near the border became a silent battleground of tensions. Farmers argued over irrigation rights, local officials struggled to maintain fairness, and old rivalries resurfaced in heated exchanges. In homes, families worried quietly about what might come next. Some parents reminded their children of past violence not out of fear, but to teach caution. Children, sensing unease in their parents' words, felt a strange mix of curiosity and anxiety. They could see the beauty of peace but also sensed the fragility of the calm around them. In cities, the signs of strain were different, but no less real. Businesses argued over access to markets and trade routes. Communities that had once cooperated now questioned each other's loyalty. Leaders faced mounting pressure to enforce the pact, ensure security, and prevent disputes from escalating. Each small argument had the potential to grow into something much larger. People realized that peace was not simply about signing a document. It required constant attention, compromise, and trust. Even with these challenges, hope remained a powerful force. Citizens organized local councils, community gatherings, and cultural festivals to strengthen bonds. People who had once been divided by politics or ideology now worked together to rebuild schools, repair roads, and restore hospitals. Volunteers delivered food to those in need. Doctors and nurses cared for the sick, and teachers returned to classrooms with determination. Every small act of cooperation, every gesture of kindness, reinforced the fragile fabric of peace and reminded people why they had fought so hard to achieve it. But the world outside these communities watched closely. International organizations, neighboring nations, and global observers noted the growing tensions. They sent warnings, advice, and sometimes aid, hoping that humanity would manage the strains without reverting to conflict. Reports circulated about pockets of unrest, highlighting how quickly minor issues could spiral into larger crises. Even as people focused on daily life, the larger reality was clear. Peace required vigilance, and any failure to address disputes could ignite the fragile calm into chaos. Among the citizens, there were those who understood the danger better than most. A group of young activists began to travel between towns, mediating arguments and promoting dialogue. They spoke to leaders, organized community meetings, and reminded everyone of the lessons learned from past wars. Their efforts were met with gratitude in some places, skepticism in others, and sometimes outright hostility. Still, they persevered, believing that small acts of understanding could prevent the collapse of everything humanity had fought to achieve. Meanwhile, some individuals allowed bitterness to grow unchecked. Old grievances and personal ambitions festered in private, and these quiet seeds of conflict began to take root. Gossip spread, rumors circulated, and mistrust quietly poisoned relationships. Leaders struggled to manage the balance between enforcing laws and respecting freedom. Citizens often found themselves torn between supporting their communities and maintaining loyalty to the larger pact. In many ways, the peace depended not just on governments, but on every individual choosing dialogue over violence, understanding over revenge. Technology, which had once been a tool of war, now played a role in both maintaining peace and amplifying tensions. News traveled faster than ever before. Videos, messages, and reports spread across cities and nations instantly. While this helped leaders communicate, it also meant that minor disputes could become public controversies overnight. Citizens watched events in distant regions and reacted emotionally, sometimes without full understanding. This created pressure on governments and communities to respond quickly, often before all the facts were known. The world was learning a difficult lesson. Peace in the modern age was as much about perception as it was about reality. In schools, children were taught the value of cooperation and empathy. Lessons about history reminded them of the cost of conflict and the importance of dialogue. Teachers encouraged students to express their feelings, solve problems together, and respect differences. Yet even as young minds learned these lessons, they could sense that adults were not always following the same path. Discussions at home often reflected uncertainty and concern. Children absorbed these subtle cues, forming their own understanding of the delicate balance between hope and fear. As the world continued to navigate this uncertain time, small incidents began to foreshadow larger challenges. A dispute over water rights escalated into a tense standoff. Trade disagreements led to protests in city streets. Leaders convened emergency meetings trying to find compromise before violence could erupt. Ordinary people watched with growing anxiety, wondering if the peace they had taken for granted could survive the pressures of real life. Each day became a reminder that peace was not a static achievement, but a continuous effort, requiring patience, courage, and wisdom from everyone involved. At the same time, humanity's resilience shone through. Communities adapted creatively to challenges, finding solutions that balanced fairness and efficiency. People shared resources, mediated conflicts, and organized joint initiatives. Local leaders emerged from unexpected places, demonstrating compassion and integrity. Ordinary citizens, often overlooked in historical narratives, became the real heroes, quietly maintaining harmony and teaching the next generation that understanding could overcome anger. Their actions reminded everyone that peace was not just about avoiding war, it was about building trust, fostering empathy, and caring for one another. Even with these positive efforts, there was an unspoken tension in the air. The world seemed to hold its breath, aware that a single spark could ignite conflicts long thought extinguished. Diplomats worked tirelessly, sending envoys and messages, trying to reinforce the pact and address grievances before they escalated. International organizations monitored the situation closely, issuing reports and recommendations. Citizens continued their lives, but in quiet moments, many wondered if the hard-won peace could survive the inevitable pressures of politics, ambition, and human nature. In small villages and bustling cities alike, people learned to live with this uncertainty. They celebrated victories like a new school opening or a harvest being successful, and mourned losses such as disputes that escalated or families still affected by the past. Life became a careful balance of hope and vigilance, joy and caution. People understood that while peace brought freedom and opportunity, it also required responsibility. They could no longer take calm for granted. Each day demanded effort to maintain trust, fairness, and empathy. And so, as the seasons changed, humanity continued to navigate this delicate period. Life was filled with laughter, work, learning, and play, but also with subtle reminders of the challenges ahead. Citizens learned that peace was never permanent, that it required attention and care, and that even the smallest conflicts could grow into larger crises if ignored. Communities strengthened bonds, children grew up learning cooperation, and leaders worked to maintain balance, all while a quiet tension lingered just beneath the surface. In this chapter of human experience, the lesson was clear. Peace, no matter how celebrated, was never guaranteed. It could be nurtured, strengthened, and expanded, but it could also be threatened by small, seemingly insignificant events. Humanity stood at a crossroads with hope on one side and caution on the other, aware that the choices made today would determine whether the fragile calm could last, or whether the world would once again face the shadows of conflict. And so, life went on, full of laughter, challenges, hope, and fear. Ordinary people, with their courage, wisdom, and kindness, quietly shaped the destiny of nations. They repaired homes, healed hearts, and nurtured understanding. The first cracks in the fragile peace grew louder than anyone had anticipated. What had seemed like small disputes between communities and nations suddenly became impossible to ignore. A minor border disagreement long simmering under the surface erupted into violence. One side accused the other of breaking agreements, while the accused demanded proof of loyalty. Diplomats rushed to mediate, but the tension had grown too strong, and their words fell short. The world watched as hope began to slip through humanity's fingers. It started quietly. A trade convoy was stopped at a checkpoint. Officials argued over documentation that had been accepted for decades. Words escalated into shouting, and shouting turned into threats. Soon the convoy was attacked by local forces claiming that the goods were smuggled or stolen. In response, the other side mobilized troops, intending only to show strength, but the demonstration quickly spiraled into armed clashes. Cities near the border emptied as families fled, unsure of what would happen next. Panic spread faster than officials could control, and the fragile calm of the previous years began to crumble. For ordinary people, the collapse was sudden and terrifying. Families who had grown comfortable with peace found themselves hiding in basements, holding their children tightly, listening to distant sounds of gunfire. Markets that had once been full of life were deserted. Shops remained closed, their owners too afraid to risk stepping outside. The sounds of laughter and daily life were replaced by whispers of fear and uncertainty. Mothers prayed quietly for their children. Fathers tried to remain calm even as worry gnawed at their hearts, and children struggled to understand why the world had suddenly returned to chaos. Leaders struggled to respond. Emergency meetings were held, and speeches were broadcast on every channel. They promised that peace would be restored, that justice would prevail, and that those responsible for breaking the agreements would be held accountable. Yet behind these words there was uncertainty. Everyone knew that the peace that had taken decades to build could collapse entirely if tensions continued to escalate. Advisors debated strategies, but no one had a clear solution. The world had reached a tipping point, and every decision carried enormous consequences. In towns and villages, the situation was equally dire. A schoolteacher who had celebrated peace just months before now faced a classroom of frightened children. Parents refused to send them out to play, and even the simplest routines, buying food, walking to school, became dangerous. Neighbors who had once shared meals and stories began to suspect each other, afraid that loyalties had shifted. Families huddled together at night, listening to distant explosions or shouting, wondering if they would survive until morning. Even those who had never experienced war firsthand felt its return in every heartbeat, every shadow and every moment of uncertainty. The conflict spread quickly, and ordinary acts of kindness were replaced by survival instincts. People hoarded supplies, barricaded doors, and formed small groups for protection. Streets that had once been filled with community life now echoed with fear and confusion. Children learned quickly to stay quiet, to avoid drawing attention, and to follow the instructions of adults who were themselves struggling to remain calm. The collapse of the Pact had turned life upside down in a matter of days, and humanity was reminded that peace could never be taken for granted. Even as chaos spread, small pockets of courage emerged. Some individuals refused to abandon hope. Community leaders organized safe passages for families trapped in conflict zones. Volunteers carried food and water to those too scared to leave their homes. Medical workers risked their own lives to care for the injured, working in makeshift clinics and often improvising with what little they had. These acts, though small compared to the scale of the conflict, became lifelines for many, proving that even in the darkest times, human compassion could shine through. Amid the panic, the media played a crucial role. Reports of the initial attack spread rapidly, bringing news to faraway cities and countries. People watched in disbelief as events unfolded. Some viewers were terrified, others were angry, and many felt helpless. Social media amplified both fear and frustration, as rumors, unverified reports, and personal accounts circulated quickly. Governments struggled to maintain control over the narrative, trying to calm citizens while also responding to the growing crisis. It became clear that in the age of instant communication, peace could be threatened not only by actions on the ground but also by the speed at which information and misinformation traveled. Families experienced the impact in deeply personal ways. A mother who had once taught her children about kindness and cooperation now had to explain why they could not leave their home. A young man who had left the battlefield for a civilian life found himself torn between protecting his family and helping his community. Elderly citizens who had survived previous conflicts faced the trauma of reliving the horrors they had tried to forget. In each story, the collapse of the Pact was not just political. It was deeply human, affecting every heart and every household. Diplomats tried desperately to prevent further escalation. Envoys traveled across borders, negotiating ceasefires and attempting to clarify misunderstandings. Yet trust had eroded too far. Actions that would have once been seen as reasonable were now interpreted as provocations. Every attempt at dialogue seemed to encounter suspicion, and every meeting was tense as if the fragile threads of understanding could snap at any moment. The world realized that while treaties and agreements were important, they were powerless without genuine trust between people, communities, and nations. As fighting continued in some regions, other areas felt the ripple effects. Trade slowed, economies faltered, and essential services were disrupted. Hospitals struggled to meet demand, schools closed, and communities once considered safe began to feel vulnerable. Fear spread like a contagion, affecting people far from the initial conflict zones. Even in areas untouched by violence, citizens felt the anxiety and uncertainty, aware that no place was entirely immune. Humanity, for all its resilience, was confronting a stark truth. Peace was not simply the absence of conflict, but a constant effort to protect it. Yet in the midst of destruction, human courage persisted. Individuals found creative ways to support each other, building shelters, sharing knowledge, and offering comfort. Neighborhoods organized watch groups to keep children safe. Volunteers delivered food on foot when roads were blocked. People offered shelter to strangers fleeing the violence. These actions, small and often unseen, created networks of support that reminded humanity of the strength found in unity and empathy. Even when governments struggled, ordinary people acted as the guardians of life and hope. For those who had lived through the first wars, the collapse of the Pact was particularly painful. Memories of lost friends, destroyed homes, and long periods of hardship returned vividly. They watched as history seemed to repeat itself and feared that lessons of the past had been forgotten. Many felt powerless to stop the cycle, while others vowed silently to protect their families and communities from repeating the same mistakes. In every village, town, and city, the human stories of fear, courage, grief, and hope played out simultaneously, shaping the world in ways far more personal than headlines could capture. The collapse of the Pact also revealed the complexity of human nature. In some cases, communities that had been at odds for decades came together to face a common threat. In other cases, old grudges resurfaced, intensifying conflicts and creating new divides. People had to navigate moral dilemmas every day, whether to trust neighbors, help strangers, or defend themselves. The lines between right and wrong blurred, showing that even in times of collapse, humans made choices guided by survival, conscience, and compassion. As days turned into weeks, the consequences of the breakdown became clearer. Economies faltered as trade routes closed. Cities prepared for mass evacuations. Soldiers, both professional and citizen volunteers, were called back to duty. The world watched as a species that had been cautiously learning to live in peace now faced the very real possibility of descending back into war. The lessons of the past, the sacrifices made for peace, and the hopes of countless families now hung in the balance. Despite the chaos, humanity's spirit was not completely broken. Acts of heroism, kindness, and cooperation continued to emerge. Families sheltered neighbors, children shared food, and communities organized defenses that were focused on protection rather than aggression. Ordinary people became extraordinary in ways that mattered most. By preserving life, protecting hope, and showing that even when agreements collapse, humanity itself could endure. These acts, often quiet and unseen, became the lifeline for many, proving that while treaties could fail, human courage and compassion could survive. And so, as the world reeled from the sudden collapse of the Pact, people learned a harsh but vital lesson. Peace is never guaranteed, no matter how long it has lasted. Trust, communication, and human empathy are fragile, and even a single spark can ignite chaos. Yet amid fear, anger, and uncertainty, the human capacity for resilience, courage, and compassion persisted. Families, communities, and ordinary citizens continued to struggle, adapt, and protect one another, determined to survive the storm and hoping that one day, true peace could be. The collapse of the Pact ignited a fury that no one could contain. What had started as a distant political conflict now became personal for millions of people. Ordinary citizens who had hoped for peace felt betrayed and angry. Families who had rebuilt their lives suddenly found themselves living in fear again, and the frustration of decades of compromise boiled over. The anger was not just directed at governments or leaders, it was a deep human response to the loss of safety, trust, and hope. People began to protest in cities and towns. At first, these demonstrations were peaceful. Citizens gathered in public squares holding signs and chanting for justice, fairness, and accountability. Mothers demanded protection for their children, workers asked for security and support, and young people demanded honesty from their leaders. Their voices were loud and united, but the underlying tension meant that even peaceful protests could easily turn violent. The line between frustration and fury blurred as the world watched a species once hopeful, now grappling with despair. As anger spread, so did acts of rebellion. In some regions, citizens blocked roads, halted trade, and organized strikes. Markets and public offices were shut down as people refused to cooperate with authorities they felt had failed them. Some groups took up arms not as soldiers, but as ordinary people trying to defend their families and neighborhoods. They were not trained fighters, but desperation gave them courage. Fear, grief, and fury became a powerful mix that drove people to act in ways they had never imagined possible. Families felt the impact in deeply personal ways. A father who had survived previous conflicts now had to decide whether to stay in his home or lead his family to safety. A mother who had taught her children the value of kindness now had to explain why strangers were fighting in the streets and why her children had to hide. Children themselves, who had known only peace in recent years, were suddenly forced to confront anger, violence, and confusion. They learned quickly that the world had changed overnight and that safety was no longer guaranteed. Communities became divided in their responses. Some chose to resist violence and hold on to hope, trying to mediate and calm tensions. Others joined protests and uprisings driven by fear and rage. Neighborhoods that had once been unified now faced internal conflict, as opinions about how to respond clashed. The once fragile trust between neighbors was tested, and human relationships were stretched to their limits. In this turmoil, every decision, every word, every action mattered. Ordinary people had to navigate not just external dangers, but the storm of emotion and uncertainty within their own communities. Amid the chaos, human resilience shone through. Some citizens worked tirelessly to protect others. They created safe zones, organized emergency shelters, and ensured that food and water reached those in need. Volunteers and community leaders risked their own safety to care for the injured, comfort the frightened, and restore a sense of humanity amid the fury. These acts of courage, though often unnoticed on a large scale, became lifelines for many, proving that even in anger and despair, compassion could survive. The fury of humanity was not uniform. It had many faces. In some cities, young people took to the streets with chants demanding change. In rural areas, families fortified their homes, preparing for possible attacks. In industrial zones, workers walked out, refusing to cooperate with authorities until their concerns were addressed. Anger was expressed in many ways, through protest, through resistance, and sometimes through confrontation. Each act was a reflection of frustration and fear, a cry for stability in a world that had suddenly turned chaotic. Governments struggled to respond. They were faced with a population that no longer trusted promises, a world watching their every move, and the risk that the fury could escalate into widespread violence. Leaders tried to calm citizens through speeches and public statements, emphasizing the need for unity and cooperation. Yet words alone were not enough. Ordinary people needed action, protection, and reassurance. Governments implemented curfews, mobilized security forces, and tried to mediate disputes, but these measures were often met with resistance, further fueling the anger of the people. Even in the midst of turmoil, ordinary people found ways to support each other. Neighbors shared food, offered shelter, and provided comfort to those too afraid to leave their homes. Communities organized volunteer networks to help the injured, assist the elderly, and care for children. These acts of empathy became a counterbalance to the widespread fury, reminding people that even in anger, humanity's spirit could shine. People realized that survival depended not just on fighting against danger, but on protecting the bonds that held society together. Media played a powerful role in shaping human emotion. Reports, images, and messages spread rapidly, amplifying anger, fear, and frustration. Social media allowed ordinary citizens to share their experiences, spreading both hope and outrage. Videos of protests, clashes, and acts of courage reached millions, influencing reactions in cities and towns far from the initial conflict. Governments struggled to manage the flow of information, knowing that perception could sometimes be as important as reality. In this new age, fury was not contained to physical spaces. It traveled instantly across borders, connecting and amplifying human emotion. For families caught in conflict zones, every day became a test of endurance. Mothers comforted children while hiding from gunfire. Fathers protected homes and communities, often risking their own lives. Elderly people who had survived past wars faced the trauma of reliving old fears. Children who had grown up believing in peace now learned the harsh lessons of anger, mistrust, and survival. The collapse of the Pact was no longer a political event. It had become a deeply human experience affecting every heart, mind, and household. In towns and cities, ordinary citizens had to make moral choices. Some chose to resist aggression peacefully, trying to maintain order and protect neighbors. Others, overwhelmed by fear and anger, joined violent protests or sought revenge for perceived wrongs. These decisions tested not only courage but conscience. People faced dilemmas they had never imagined, realizing that in times of fury, even good intentions could lead to unintended consequences. Humanity was forced to confront its own complexity, the coexistence of compassion and rage, courage and fear, hope and despair. Even as anger spread, small stories of resilience emerged. A group of volunteers carried water and food to a neighborhood under siege. A teacher risked her safety to ensure that children could continue learning in makeshift classrooms. A young man whose home had been destroyed helped neighbors rebuild their shelters before attending to his own needs. These acts of human decency, often unnoticed by the wider world, reminded people that in the midst of fury, compassion and courage were still possible. They showed that even when agreements fail and anger erupts, the human spirit could endure. The world watched humanity's fury with concern. International observers noted that the anger was not just about politics, it was personal, emotional, and deeply human. People were not only frustrated with leaders, they were grieving the loss of safety, trust, and stability. Analysts warned that if this fury continued unchecked, it could escalate into long-term conflict, undoing decades of peace-building. Governments, organizations, and communities faced the daunting task of responding to a population whose anger was both justified and unpredictable. In homes across the world, ordinary conversations reflected the tension. Parents discussed safety, shared warnings, and tried to teach children how to navigate the dangers around them. Young people debated the fairness of the situation, questioning why peace had failed and what could be done to restore it. Elders shared stories of past struggles, offering lessons while warning of repeating mistakes. Every household became a microcosm of the larger conflict, with anger, fear, and hope all intertwined. The fury of humanity also revealed the resilience of human relationships. Even in anger, people cared for each other, forming alliances and support networks to face the challenges ahead. Neighborhood committees were formed to manage disputes, distribute resources, and protect vulnerable members. Volunteers and everyday citizens became leaders in their communities, showing that courage and empathy were not confined to politicians or soldiers. They existed in every person willing to act. Humanity discovered that even in times of fury, unity and compassion could survive. As the days passed, the consequences of fury became more evident. Economic activity slowed, essential services were disrupted, and communities struggled to maintain stability. Families faced food shortages, disrupted education, and the constant threat of violence. Yet even in this chaos, the human capacity for courage and cooperation persisted. People shared resources, protected one another, and refused to let anger destroy the bonds that held their communities together. It was a lesson in both the danger of unchecked fury and the enduring strength of human empathy. Even amid destruction, small victories brought hope. A community that had organized a safe zone allowed children to play for the first time in weeks. Volunteers rebuilt a destroyed clinic, ensuring medical care for the sick and injured. Families reunited after being separated by the chaos. These moments, though small compared to the scale of anger and violence, reminded people that hope and humanity could survive. Even in the fury that had swept across nations and communities began to calm in some areas, but it left behind a world scarred and uncertain. The collapse of the Pact and the outpouring of anger forced humanity to confront not only external threats, but also the struggles within themselves. People realized that surviving chaos was only part of the battle. The harder challenge was navigating moral dilemmas, understanding one another, and finding ways to rebuild trust and unity in the midst of lingering fear. In cities and villages, alike, ordinary people faced difficult choices every day. Some were confronted with neighbors whose actions had contributed to the conflict. Others had to decide whether to protect family and friends at the expense of broader community safety. A young man, who had once joined protests fueled by anger, now wondered if retaliation had been the right choice. A mother who had hidden her children from danger had to decide whether to stay in their damaged home or seek safety elsewhere. Each decision carried consequences, and no one had a clear guide to follow. Communities began to realize that reconciliation required courage of a different kind. It was not just about stopping violence, it was about rebuilding trust. Leaders organized meetings where citizens could speak openly about grievances and fears. Families shared stories of loss and suffering, sometimes finding unexpected common ground. People who had once been enemies in the streets now sat together to discuss how to restore their neighborhoods. These conversations were not easy. Emotions ran high, and old wounds resurfaced. Yet for those willing to listen and forgive, small bridges began to form. In rural areas, reconciliation took on a very practical form. Farmers who had fought over land or water during the conflicts now had to work side by side to survive. Crops needed tending, irrigation systems had to be repaired, and animals had to be cared for. Cooperation became essential not only for survival, but also for the fragile hope of rebuilding life. Some villagers began informal councils to mediate disputes and organize joint efforts. These councils were often led by ordinary citizens, whose authority came from respect and experience rather than official titles. Their work showed that leadership could be found in anyone willing to take responsibility and act with integrity. Even as communities sought reconciliation, the internal struggles of individuals were complex and deeply human. People grappled with guilt over actions taken during the fury, words shouted in anger, decisions made in fear, or moments when they had turned away from suffering neighbors. Some found it difficult to forgive themselves or others. A young woman who had once shouted at a neighbor in anger now worked to help the same person rebuild their home. A man who had hoarded resources during the chaos now shared his supplies freely, hoping to make amends. These personal journeys revealed that rebuilding peace was not only about political agreements, but also about the choices each person made. Every day, schools and educational institutions played an essential role in healing. Teachers focused not only on academic lessons but also on emotional growth and social responsibility. Children who had witnessed chaos were encouraged to talk about their feelings and learn how to cooperate with peers from different backgrounds. Students practiced empathy, problem-solving, and conflict resolution. They learned that human relationships were fragile and required constant care. In classrooms, the seeds of a future society that valued understanding and cooperation were being planted, one lesson at a time. Health workers, too, became agents of reconciliation. Hospitals had been overwhelmed during the fury, and medical staff had faced impossible choices. Now they worked not only to heal the physical injuries of conflict but also to address emotional trauma. Therapists and counselors traveled to towns and villages, helping families process grief and fear. Communities learned that physical survival alone was not enough. Emotional healing was equally vital. People began to understand that true recovery required attention to both body and heart, and that forgiveness and understanding were necessary to prevent future conflicts. The media, which had amplified anger during the collapse, now had a role in promoting reconciliation. Stories of courage, cooperation, and compassion spread across regions. Videos of volunteers helping former rivals, communities rebuilding destroyed infrastructure together, and neighbors protecting each other encouraged a sense of unity. Ordinary citizens saw examples of how human actions could create positive change, even in the aftermath of chaos. These stories reminded people that humanity's strength was not in violence or fury, but in empathy, courage, and solidarity. In homes, families learned new lessons about communication and compromise. Parents discussed past mistakes openly, teaching children that mistakes were part of being human, but that forgiveness and effort could restore trust. Siblings who had argued during the fury now worked together to help their parents and neighbors. Neighbors repaired relationships by listening, acknowledging wrongs, and making gestures of goodwill. Across the world, ordinary people realized that reconciliation was not just a political process. It was a deeply personal one, rooted in daily interactions and choices. At the same time, the challenges of reconciliation were daunting. Trust once broken was difficult to rebuild. People feared that old grudges might resurface. Families worried that neighbors or strangers could turn against them. Leaders had to balance law enforcement with empathy, ensuring security without creating resentment. Every effort to restore peace required careful attention to both justice and humanity. Ordinary citizens, often overlooked in historical accounts, became the true architects of this fragile recovery. Their willingness to forgive, cooperate, and act with integrity shaped the future of their communities. Religious and cultural leaders also played a significant role. They emphasized shared values, compassion, and forgiveness. They encouraged communities to hold ceremonies of reconciliation, honoring those lost while committing to peace in the future. These gatherings created space for people to express grief, share experiences, and build understanding. Rituals of healing reminded everyone that while the fury had left scars, it was possible to create meaning from suffering and to move forward together. Meanwhile, governments worked to restore order and provide support. Infrastructure, trade, and essential services had been disrupted during the collapse. Officials coordinated aid, repaired roads, reopened schools, and ensured access to food and medicine. Policies were adjusted to promote fairness, and efforts were made to include voices from communities affected by the fury. Citizens gradually regained confidence that their governments were working not just for political survival, but for the common good. Yet these efforts would only succeed if ordinary people actively participated, showing that reconciliation was a partnership between authority and citizens. Even as progress was made, the world was reminded that reconciliation was not linear. Setbacks occurred. Minor conflicts flared, misunderstandings arose, and mistrust occasionally returned. Families struggled to forgive past wrongs, communities debated the allocation of resources, and leaders faced difficult choices about justice and fairness. Yet, each challenge also presented an opportunity for humanity to prove its capacity for empathy, resilience, and cooperation. Every act of kindness, every compromise, and every effort to rebuild trust strengthened the foundations of a more enduring peace. Ordinary acts of courage and compassion became the quiet heroes of this chapter. A young man who had once joined protests helped rebuild a neighbor's home. A mother organized food distribution for families who had lost everything. Children shared what little they had with peers who were hungry. These actions, small on the surface, had a ripple effect that strengthened communities. They reminded everyone that humanity's power lay not only in governments or leaders, but in the countless small choices made by ordinary people every day. In villages and cities, lessons about human behavior were learned quickly. People realized that anger and fear were natural but destructive when left unchecked. Compassion and cooperation, though sometimes requiring courage and sacrifice, were the pathways to survival and growth. Families, neighbors, and communities learned that reconciliation was not a passive act, but an active one, requiring effort, dialogue, and understanding. Humanity began to understand that the strength of a society lay not in its weapons or laws, but in its empathy and shared humanity. Slowly, life regained rhythm. Children returned to schools, families rebuilt homes, and markets began to buzz with activity once again. Communities worked together to repair roads, clear debris, and restore public spaces. Neighbors visited one another, exchanging meals and stories, reminding each other that the bonds broken during the fury could be mended with patience and care. Ordinary people discovered that reconciliation was not just about restoring what had been lost, but about creating something stronger, connections, trust, and understanding that could endure future challenges. Even as healing progressed, the memory of the fury remained. People did not forget the anger, fear, or losses they had experienced. Instead, they used these memories as guides, teaching children and newcomers about the consequences of unchecked rage and the importance of empathy. Families held conversations about past mistakes. Communities organized lessons and gatherings to reinforce cooperation, and leaders employ. The world had survived fury, conflict, and fear, but it was far from the peace that people had once hoped for. What remained was a fragile calm, a cautious rhythm of life that had been rebuilt from the ashes of anger and mistrust. The collapse of the Pact and the subsequent chaos had left deep scars, but humanity had learned vital lessons about resilience, compassion, and the value of cooperation. People realized that peace was never guaranteed. It was a choice, a daily effort, and a responsibility shared by everyone. In cities and towns, life gradually found a new balance. Markets reopened with care, families returned to homes that had been repaired, and children cautiously returned to playgrounds and schools. Streets that had been empty during the fury were once again filled with the sounds of daily life, though there was a new awareness in every step and glance. People moved with caution, remembering the recent past, but they also carried a quiet hope that tomorrow could be better. Each small act of rebuilding, repairing a roof, planting a garden, teaching a child became a testament to the human spirit and its determination to survive and thrive. Communities, scarred but resilient, began to hold gatherings to honor those lost and to strengthen bonds among neighbors. People shared meals, stories, and memories, creating rituals that reinforced understanding and empathy. Elders spoke to younger generations, teaching them the consequences of anger and the importance of dialogue. Children, who had grown up amidst fear and chaos, were given guidance not only in academics but in moral lessons about patience, cooperation, and compassion. The past was never forgotten, but it was transformed into a tool for learning rather than a source of fear. In rural areas, farmers and villagers who had once clashed over resources now worked together with renewed purpose. Crops were tended, livestock cared for, and water systems repaired. Informal councils that had been formed during the fury continued to guide communities, mediating disputes and ensuring fair distribution of resources. Trust, which had been shattered, was slowly being rebuilt through repeated acts of cooperation and fairness. Ordinary people realized that even the smallest gestures, sharing food, helping with repairs, listening to one another, could restore relationships and stabilize communities. Families played a central role in the healing process. Parents explained the importance of empathy and cooperation, sharing lessons learned from the chaos. Children, who had witnessed fear and anger firsthand, were encouraged to speak openly about their feelings and experiences. Siblings learned to support one another, neighbors worked together to rebuild damaged homes, and communities began to recognize the strength in unity. These lessons were subtle but powerful, forming the foundation for a future where human relationships would be valued as much as physical safety. At the same time, governments worked tirelessly to restore broader stability. Infrastructure that had been damaged during the conflict, roads, schools, hospitals, was repaired. Policies were adjusted to ensure fairness, and programs were launched to support families affected by the fury. Leaders emphasized dialogue, transparency, and accountability, realizing that the trust of citizens was as crucial as any law or agreement. International observers monitored progress, offering support and guidance, but it was ultimately the choices and actions of ordinary people that determined whether peace could endure. Despite these efforts, the scars of conflict were visible everywhere. Cities bore the marks of destruction, and families still mourned loved ones lost during the fury. Memories of fear lingered, influencing behavior and decisions. People were cautious, hesitant to trust too quickly, and careful in every action. Yet within this caution lay wisdom. Humanity had learned that peace was not a state to be assumed. It was a practice to be cultivated. Every handshake, every conversation, and every act of cooperation became a small step toward long-term stability. In this period of recovery, acts of heroism and compassion continued to inspire others. Volunteers who had risked their lives during the fury now organized education programs, healthcare initiatives, and community rebuilding projects. Young people who had once taken to the streets in anger were now teaching lessons about empathy and cooperation. Teachers, doctors, and ordinary citizens shared their knowledge and experience freely, demonstrating that courage and compassion were not limited to grand gestures. They existed in everyday choices and actions. Communication became a tool not for spreading fear, as it had during the fury, but for building understanding. Stories of reconciliation, cooperation, and resilience were shared widely, inspiring communities to adopt similar practices. Families spoke openly about past mistakes, neighbors mediated disputes before they escalated, and local leaders prioritized dialogue over punishment. Humanity began to realize that survival depended not only on avoiding violence, but on actively fostering empathy and mutual respect. These lessons became embedded in the daily lives of people everywhere, Education played a central role in shaping the next generation. Children learned not only reading, writing, and mathematics, but also emotional intelligence, conflict resolution, and cooperation. Schools emphasized the importance of listening, understanding different perspectives, and helping others. Children were encouraged to think critically about anger and fear, recognizing the consequences of unchecked emotion. Through these lessons, humanity aimed to create a generation that could maintain peace not through force, but through understanding, empathy, and shared responsibility. Healthcare workers continued to address both physical and emotional scars. Counseling programs, community therapy sessions, and support networks were established to help people process trauma. Families who had been separated during the Fury were reunited, and children received care for the emotional impact of conflict. These efforts reinforced the understanding that peace was not merely the absence of violence, but the presence of well-being, trust, and emotional healing. Humanity realized that only by nurturing the heart could it prevent future cycles of anger and chaos. Religious and cultural leaders continued to play an important role in guiding communities. They emphasized forgiveness, compassion, and understanding, reminding people of the shared values that had once been overshadowed by fear and anger. Ceremonies honoring those lost became opportunities to teach younger generations about the consequences of fury and the importance of maintaining unity. Communities discovered that traditions, rituals, and cultural practices could be powerful tools in fostering empathy, resilience, and reconciliation. Even in this cautious hope, challenges remained. Minor disputes occasionally flared, resources were still limited in some areas, and mistrust lingered in the hearts of those deeply affected by the Fury. Leaders had to remain vigilant, communities had to continue working together, and families had to nurture empathy and understanding in daily life. Humanity recognized that peace was never a final destination. It was an ongoing effort, a collective responsibility, and a delicate balance of courage, wisdom, and compassion. Small victories, however, reinforced hope. Children played in streets that had been empty, neighbors shared meals and laughter, and markets buzzed with activity once again. Communities repaired infrastructure, cleared debris, and restored public spaces. Ordinary people discovered that recovery was not only about rebuilding what had been lost, but about creating something stronger, a society built on cooperation, empathy, and trust. These victories were not grand or flashy, but they were meaningful, forming the foundation for a more resilient and compassionate future. In households, families reflected on the lessons learned from the Fury and the collapse of the Pact. Parents shared stories of courage, resilience, and reconciliation, teaching children that even in the darkest times human spirit could endure. Siblings learned to resolve conflicts through dialogue rather than anger. Neighbors rebuilt relationships that had been strained. Communities discovered that healing was a collective effort, one that required patience, understanding, and the willingness to forgive. Humanity also learned the importance of vigilance. The collapse of the Pact had shown how quickly trust and peace could be shattered. People understood that maintaining stability required continuous effort, listening to one another, addressing grievances early, and fostering empathy in every interaction. Leaders emphasized transparency, citizens practiced cooperation, and communities built support networks to prevent small conflicts from escalating. Humanity had discovered that lasting peace was not passive. It required conscious and deliberate action every day. Technology, once used to amplify anger during the collapse, now became a tool for connection and healing. Communication platforms spread stories of reconciliation, shared knowledge, and promoted understanding. Citizens connected across cities, regions, and nations, exchanging experiences and lessons learned. Online networks supported communities with practical advice, emotional support, and inspiration. Humanity realized that technology, when used responsibly, could amplify empathy and foster cooperation on a scale never before possible. Slowly, the world began to feel like a safer, kinder place. Families returned to routines, communities cooperated to rebuild, and citizens learned to navigate conflict with dialogue rather than violence. The lessons of the past, anger, fury, fear, and destruction, remained fresh in memory, but they were now